UK's education ministry has just announced that they're going to issue guidance. This is like they announced about the announcement about the announcement. Anyway, guidance is coming about banning the use of cell phones in schools. As of 2018, 95% of schools in the UK already had restrictions, but they vary. You know, some schools are like, let's put the phones in a bag at the beginning of the day and you get it at the end of the day. Other schools, you get to keep it, but you're only allowed to use it in between class time. This is going to be a blanket no cell phones in schools. And they are going to join France, China, and the Netherlands is going to also join in 2024.
Those Netherlands cell phones, however, will be powered largely by non-renewable sources of electricity, as we now know. It is definitely true that I am, judging from the arguments that I get into with people, more lax in my sense of immediate harm and or peril of teenagers being on smart devices, smartphones. Insofar as, you know, we had this discussion with Jonathan Haidt a while back, who's also a member of the Progress Network, about whether or not the notable spikes in reported teen mental health issues is attributable to social media, which are largely consumed via smartphones these days, or a whole series of other issues that are besetting modern society, and that we may be sort of conflating things or assuming causation where there's simply correlation. And we can have and should continue to have these debates on the podcast and the newsletter as a society. When it comes to schools and phones, you know, there I think my attitudes are much more, insofar as those can be hugely distracting and detach people from either engaging with peers in a group discussion or engaging with the material. Just like I'm not a big fan of phones at dinner with friends. I mean, I might check a fact or Google something, because it used to be that when you debated over a factual point at dinner with friends, whoever was shouting the loudest sort of won the argument, and then you went home and looked it up in the encyclopedia. Now you can just Google it at dinner and get on with it. So I am in favor of a little bit of dinner Googling, depending on the conversation.
Or podcast Googling.
And adding a dollop of fact. I just Googled the Netherlands thing, which I think was helpful for the conversation. Otherwise, I might have blithely gone on and asserted a fact that was completely incorrect. So I think a limited amount of dinner Googling is helpful. It could even be useful for a teacher during a class lesson if a student asks a question and they don't know the answer, to like look up the answer in real time. But for the most part, phones are, I think, an unnecessary school distraction. I don't know if I agree on you should like put it in a bag at 8:30 and collect it again at 4:30. And I think if you've got a free period or some time, maybe it's okay to do so. I suppose the pushback from the schools would be lunchtime and break time should be a time for people to sort of have to engage each other, and the phones mitigate against that. But I think at most of these schools, you can go into your computer anyway if you need to do a lesson during that time. So I'm not sure the no smartphone thing makes total sense in downtimes. But it's all, to me, the point of all of this should be balance, right? Are you obsessed and lost in a device, or anything else for that matter? Or is that simply part of the toolkit that you bring to bear at a daily basis in how you interact with the world? And balance is hard to find. And the reason why you and I have had these discussions and where I've pushed back a bit is by banning something or saying, no, 100%, you are creating, in my sense, at times an extreme reaction to an extreme problem. And I think extremes tend to beget extremes as opposed to engender balance. And I think balance is what we need to strive for, whether it's social media consumption, whether it's alcohol consumption, whether it's anything, whether it's how we engage in political debates. Balance is kind of the key. And it's one of the points of this whole endeavor, right? To find a way to talk about things with balance, negative and positive, pro and con. So that's my very long-winded response to your very simple question.
that was a lovely abstract monologue about balance. I agree with you when it comes to adults, right? Because adults have the ability. Like I remember when I got my first smartphone, and I did experience a lot of the negative effects that have to do with smartphones and social media. But because I'm an adult, I figured it out, and now I have balance, and now I'm able to appreciate the pros and deal with the cons. But I was in my 20s, and that took me until I was in my 30s, probably. So it's a different situation when you're talking about, I think a lot of people would say this, and I think I mostly agree with this. So it's a different situation when you're talking about children and teens. They're going to have their phones the rest of their day. So if they don't have them for 8 hours in school, they're going to get them when they leave, and they're going to have them over the weekend. I don't view that. I don't view a ban in school of not having your phone as extreme. I view it as more of a middle ground in an already extreme situation.
I think the question is, what message is that ban sending to students? Is it sending the message of, we perceive these devices and the use and consumption of the information on them to be toxic and harmful and distracting, and therefore we're going to take them away in a sort of abstinence approach during the school day, versus teaching people how to be balanced, both by doing and also working with students about how to do that. And that may be a tall order, and maybe that's something families ought to do. But I get nervous when you ban something, full stop, which is different than saying you can't use your phone in class, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting there should be a complete laissez-faire attitude toward all this. I'm saying that bans on the face of it, just like abstinence, just like no drinking, just like no drugs, just like no sex, all these things backfire because they don't allow for how do people then figure out the balance that you described, some of which you learned and I learned and we all learned by going to excess, right? We don't tend to find that balance simply magically wading our way into it, right? It's an ebb, it's a flow, it's pushing those boundaries. It's not always understanding them. And again, as you just said, that may be a lovely abstract answer to a much more concrete, pragmatic problem.
I'll say one thing is that the examples that you use are interesting, right? For bans, sex, alcohol, drugs, all those things are banned in school, and no one thinks that that's weird. Like no one would be like, I definitely think that we should let people have sex in the bathrooms in between class time because they need to figure out how to deal with the world in which you'll have sex, right? It's school. Like that's not the
Totally
place.
Fair. Totally fair.
I will say that. I will also say that when I bring up stuff on the podcast that has to do with other nations making decisions, I really love thinking about whether that would apply in the US, because I love the idea of taking good ideas, right? In the US, I think this one in particular would be very difficult since all of these decisions would be made, I guess, at a district level. I guess they could be made at a state level, probably never going to be made at a federal level. And there would be enormous pushback because of the fear of guns in schools, of parents not being able to get in touch with their kids. So that's one thing where I do feel like the US is just not, that's going to be a major impediment to any kind of discussion around this in the United States.
There have been a whole bunch of private schools, however, in the United States that have done exactly what you've described. Sort of phoneless days. You check your phone at the door and you pick it up and that's certainly true in middle school. I mean, that was true at my son's school. High school is different, right? But there's definitely a willingness in a lot of private schools to make phone use during the school day not permissible. And look, your point about these other bans and that this is school and there's a place for it is totally legit. And clearly we're still trying to figure out like what the right balance is between these devices. It's just these devices are also sources of amazing education and information. And to the degree that can be woven into your day, that could actually be quite constructive.
Yeah. And just from an individual perspective, like there's so much media discourse out there about people being attached to their phone. But on another token, I live by myself. I work from home. If I was not on my phone at times during the day, I would be drowning in loneliness, right? Like that's not a normal situation for most of humanity. My phone is my lifeline to my friends in Greece, my friends in the United States, coworkers, like it's everything. So I definitely agree with you on that front that they should not be looked at as just sources of bad stuff.
Bad distraction.
Bad
Bad
stuff.
stuff.
Bad
Bad
stuff.
stuff.